John Fitzgerald Kennedy, the young, charismatic president of the United States, the person who the magical aura around him in the White House is compared to the mythical Camelot of King Arthur's time, gunned down in his prime on a Dallas street, November 22nd, 1963. That's what people remember about him, that he was assassinated. There's some controversy over who killed him. But what did President Kennedy actually accomplish during his time in office? And importantly for our purposes, what was his relationship to the Jews and to the state of Israel? I'm Maxwell Rotbart from Wyoming Jewish Academy, pioneering online Jewish education. And after watching this video, you'll know a little bit more about how he rose to the presidency, how his views on the Jews and Israel differed from that of his father. You'll learn a little bit more about the trips that he took to Israel, which Jews he appointed to prominent positions in the United States government. You'll learn about his Middle East peace plan, and you'll discover which Israeli leaders liked him, didn't like him, and why. President Kennedy was born in Brookline, Massachusetts in 1917. Came from a prominent Irish Catholic family. His grandfather had been the mayor of Boston. His father later became the American ambassador to the United Kingdom. Two of his brothers became U.S. senators. He went to elite boarding schools. He attended Harvard University, where he studied government. This was somebody who, to use a common expression, or maybe it's not so common any longer, was born with a silver spoon in his mouth. He had everything going for him. Of course, that's not quite true. We know now that he suffered from crippling medical issues, digestive tract issues, back pains. These were things that took him out of school for much of the time. Harvard University was actually the third university he went to. The first two he had to drop out of because of his medical issues. But he persevered, he pushed through despite the adversity. And when he graduated in 1940 from Harvard, he published his thesis as a book called Why England Slept. And this book gave him incredible renown at a very young age. He was only 23 years old at the time, which interestingly was halfway through his life already, because keep in mind he was killed at age 46 in Dallas. And the book Why England Slept tried to understand why was it that the English government thought that they could appease Hitler. Why did they think that they could get Hitler to not go to war against England? And this book, this thesis, really not only propelled his name forward as an important intellectual thinker, but it directed his worldview in many ways, in that he didn't believe that appeasement was possible. He didn't believe that when you had a dictator, you could talk nice and give concessions and hope that things would turn out okay. He was very much a realist. He joined the U.S. Navy shortly before the U.S. got involved in World War II. Actually, he had been rejected already from the Army, and his father used their family connections in order to push not only for his son to get into the Navy, but to get into a leadership position in the Navy, and then to be sent out to the front lines, which is exactly where Jack Kennedy, Jack was his nickname, wanted to be. In August 1943, at age 26, he was the commander of a cruiser called PT-109 that was sailing off the coast of the Solomon Islands when it was destroyed by a Japanese warship. He and his men found themselves in the water. One of his men was badly burnt. And Kennedy, although himself injured and having all these medical issues, including the bad back, he took the injured sailor, put him on his back, swam the man all the way to shore, commanded his troops along the way, told them where to hide out, eventually was able to communicate with the U.S. Navy and get them rescued, and he was declared a war hero because of this. He received all sorts of medals upon his return to the United States, and combined with his thesis of Why England Slept, he really became very well known, not just as an intellectual now, but just truly as an American hero. This propelled him in the first election after World War II, the congressional elections of 1946, to run for Congress. He was elected as a Democrat representing Boston, Massachusetts. He was 29 years old at the time. In 1952, when he was 35, he was elected to the U.S. Senate from Massachusetts. The following year, he married the glamorous Jacqueline Bouvier, who was 24 years old, daughter of a wealthy family. They had two children, Carolyn Kennedy and John F. Kennedy Jr. A third child, Patrick, would die as an infant. And he just seemed to have it all. He won the Pulitzer Prize in 1957 as a U.S. Senator for his book, Profiles in Courage, in which he looked at famous American senators who went against their own party interest for what they considered to be the national good. And in 1960, at age 43, he ran for president of the United States. And he beat the vice president of the United States, Richard Nixon, in what turned out to be one of the closest elections in American history. As president, he introduced plans to fight racism, to fight inner city poverty, neither of which actually came to fruition during his time as president, but which laid the groundwork for what his successor, Lyndon Johnson, was able to achieve in the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and in the so-called War on Poverty. From a foreign policy perspective, Kennedy's main challenges came from the island of Cuba, which is only 90 miles off the coast of Florida, as there's a communist government led by the dictator Fidel Castro that Kennedy tried to dislodge unsuccessfully. We actually launched an invasion of Cuba called the Bay of Pigs invasion that failed. When it turned out that Russia was putting missiles in Cuba aimed at the United States, he was able to successfully negotiate with Russia in order to have those missiles removed, thus successfully resolving what was known as the Cuban Missile Crisis. But what of Kennedy's ties with the Jews? Early on in Kennedy's political career, even just as he started his run for Congress, he was very interested in reaching out to the Jewish community and forming ties with them. He consulted with Boston Jews about what it was that was most important to the Jewish community so that he could support them. And part of the question here is why? And it's pretty clear throughout his life that Kennedy had a sincere sympathy for the Jewish people. And it may be based on the fact that he was Catholic, and in the United States at the time, Catholics were still considered a persecuted minority, much as Jews were, not persecuted by the government, but by people who were just bigots in their day-to-day life. Kennedy had gone to Protestant schools where he would have been one of the only Catholic students, and that was probably very much a challenge for him. And I think he saw that in the Jewish people a kindred spirit of people who were mistreated because of who they are. While he was in college, he had first visited Palestine, which eventually became the state of Israel. At the time, it was under British control. And he expressed sympathy for Zionism, this as a college student, and for the idea of creating a Jewish state. And what's notable about this is that his father, to whom he actually shared these views, had very oppositional views. Joe Kennedy, President Kennedy's father, was largely viewed by the Jewish community as being an anti-Semite. He's someone who believed that Jews unnecessarily pushed for war, that the Jews were going to drag England and the United States into an unnecessary war against Hitler just because Hitler was persecuting the Jews. He is someone who felt the Jews were the main obstacle to Middle Eastern peace, and that there would be stability in the region if it hadn't just been for Zionism. These were ideas that his son, Jack Kennedy, the president of the United States, rejected. While Kennedy was, in fact, a U.S. congressman, he paid an official visit to Israel. And very notably, and unlike many other politicians before and since, he did not visit any of the countries surrounding Israel, none of the Arab countries. The point of the visit was to be there and supportive of the state of Israel. When he ran for Senate, he actively and he specifically worked to establish ties with the Jewish community to earn their vote. And as a senator, he proposed legislation in the United States Senate that would have brought more Jews into the United States from countries around the world, particularly from Arab countries, which had been expelling their Jews in the wake of Israel becoming a country in 1948. When Kennedy ran for president in 1960, he received an astonishing 82% of the Jewish vote. Having been elected, he appointed two Jewish people to his cabinet. He appointed Abe Ribicoff as Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare, and he appointed Arthur Goldberg as Secretary of Labor. Later on in his presidency, President Kennedy would actually name Arthur Goldberg to be a justice on the United States Supreme Court. When he became president, Kennedy was taking over from a foreign policy towards Israel that had been established by Presidents Truman and then Eisenhower, Truman being a Democrat, Eisenhower being a Republican, neither of whom sold weapons to Israel. Israel received its main source of foreign arms at the time from France, but France was cooling towards Israel, and Israel was feeling a particular amount of pressure as Arab countries were receiving weapons from the Soviet Union, and as Arab countries had hired ex-Nazi scientists to help them design weapons specifically to target the state of Israel. And so, as president, Kennedy reversed the policy of the United States. He reversed the policy of Truman and of Eisenhower, and he began selling significant amounts of weapons, important weapons, modern weapons, to the state of Israel. In addition to that, he tripled the amount of humanitarian aid that the United States had been sending to Israel under the Eisenhower administration. Part of Kennedy's vocal support for Zionism, and this was something that he himself had expressed, was because he felt a kinship to the Irish people, his ancestors, who had been persecuted by the British. He saw the Jews as a historically persecuted people. And just as he wanted the Irish to have independence in Ireland, he wanted to see the Jews have independence in their historic homeland of Israel. President Kennedy told Golda Meir, Israel's foreign minister at the time, that he would treat Israel as an ally, even though there was no official treaty to have him do so, that he viewed a special relationship, his words, a special relationship between the United States and Israel. He said the only other country in the world to whom the United States would have such warm ties would be to the United Kingdom. And this idea of a special relationship has been echoed by almost every president since Kennedy. And the idea is that even without a formal mutual defense treaty, even without the formal status of an ally, which Israel lacked during Kennedy's presidency, Israel was above all of that, that the ties of the state of Israel to the United States were based on shared values of freedom and democracy, and Kennedy felt that the United States had a special commitment towards the state of Israel. This was something incredible because, again, the only two other presidents who Israel had ever known were Truman and Eisenhower, and neither of them expressed anything nearly as warm towards Israel as Kennedy had. Kennedy also told Golda Meir that should Israel ever be invaded by the Arab countries surrounding it, the United States would have its back. The United States would be there to protect the state of Israel. With all that said, President Kennedy received criticism from the Jewish community because he didn't do more to change the culture of the U.S. State Department, which was very much pro-Arab and anti-Israel. The State Department officially worked for Kennedy, but it continued to voice support for the Arab countries and criticize Israel, even as President Kennedy was doing the opposite. And this really came to fore in 1962 after Syria started shelling northern Israel, and Israel responded militarily, and the United States joined the United Nations, at least the US State Department did, in criticizing Israel. And Jews felt that Kennedy should have done more to stand in the way of his own State Department and prevent them from doing so. One thing that Kennedy did, however, in response, is he announced that the U.S. State Department would no longer receive briefings from the American Jewish Council. The American Jewish Council was an anti-Zionist organization that the U.S. State Department turned to represent the views of American Jewry. And President Kennedy said, no, the views of American Jewry are now going to be represented by Zionist organizations, not by the anti-Zionist ones. The main area of tension, however, between Kennedy and the Israeli government itself came when Israel started working to develop a nuclear reactor in Dimona, Israel. Kennedy wanted to keep nuclear weapons out of the Middle East, and he consistently pushed the state of Israel to allow the United States to inspect Dimona, to inspect the nuclear reactor to ensure it was not being developed for military purposes. And David Ben-Gurion, the prime minister of Israel, deeply resented that Kennedy kept insisting on this. He felt that it did not indicate friendship. However, Golda Meir, who was the foreign minister and who had the most ties with Kennedy, viewed him very warmly and believed that Kennedy was a true and genuine friend of the state of Israel. She herself was ambivalent about Dimona and Israel's policy towards nuclear weapons, which may have contributed to that as well. One issue that President Kennedy worked with the state of Israel was on trying to get Israel to bring back into the state of Israel the descendants of Arabs or the Arabs themselves who had fled from the country in 1948 to neighboring Arab states. The neighboring Arab states kept these refugees, what they call the Palestinian refugees, in camp. They did not allow them to integrate into the larger Arab society and kept pushing for Israel to allow these Arabs to return to the state of Israel. From Israel's perspective, doing so would completely dilute the Jewish population of the state of Israel and would lead to Israel losing its Jewish character. Kennedy came up with the plan, which was known as the Johnson Plan, because of the diplomat Joseph Johnson, who developed it for Kennedy. And the plan was that any Palestinian refugee should be allowed to do one of three things: either come to Israel, integrate into the Arab countries around it, or if a Palestinian refugee wanted to stay in a refugee camp, to receive compensation from the state of Israel for the land that Palestinian would have lost in 1948. He actually came close to getting Israel to agree to this deal, especially after Israel worked with Kennedy to negotiate that no more than 1/10 of the Palestinian refugees would be allowed into the state of Israel. However, the US State Department undermined the president by printing a different version of this plan. And in the version that the State Department printed and distributed to all of the Arab countries, which went against President Kennedy's instructions, it said that Israel would be willing to accept all of the refugees. Then the State Department tried to get Israel to sign this agreement without rereading it with the changes. However, Golda Meir caught the changes and refused to sign it. Didn't really make a difference anyway, because the Arabs also refused to sign it. And the reason the Arabs refused to sign it, they did not want to allow any of the Palestinian refugees to integrate into their countries. President Kennedy was largely seen by the Jewish community as a friend to the Jews, as a friend to the state of Israel. He was deeply devoted to trying to create a peaceful and secure Middle East for Israel to live in, but unfortunately that didn't work out. President Kennedy offered his services, in fact, to the Arab countries, saying, "I will mediate a peace agreement on your behalf with the state of Israel," but he was turned down largely because he was seen as being too pro-Israel himself by the Arab countries. Kennedy refused to accept the idea that Israel was the cause of the unrest in the Middle East, and he actually blamed the Arabs for saying, your internal rivalries and your refusal to make peace with Israel, that's the real cause of disturbances in the Middle East. You need to do more to care for your own people. You need to set aside your own internal differences, and you need to do more to create a lasting, comprehensive peace with Israel. President Kennedy's murder in Dallas on November 22nd, 1963 was a significant blow to the state of Israel. Israel had never known a president who had been warmer to the country than Kennedy had been, and many Jews worried about what was going to come next. Just after President Kennedy's funeral, which Golda Meir attended, she was approached by the new President of the United States, Lyndon Johnson, who said to her, "I know you have lost a friend, but I hope you'll understand that I'm a friend too." Indeed, Israel and the Jewish people had lost a friend, but President Johnson was true to his word to Golda Meir, and he turned out to be a friend to the Jewish people as well. For Wyoming Jewish Academy, I'm Maxwell Rotbart.